In works of fiction, there are some worlds that I like to call a sandbox. You remember playing in one of those? How sometimes maybe you want to build a sandcastle, or drive cars around in the dirt, or build a sandcastle, drive your cars around it, and then suddenly a T-Rex shows up and destroys everything. If you can't relate, the most recognizable piece of media I could think of that would be considered a sandbox would be the Star Wars series. Yeah, the 3 trilogy movie series follow one after each other, but the series also has books, comics, and shows that don't relate to the movies at all, or the story branches off from the main Sith vs. Jedi storyline. They explore different parts of the universe, or the remains of tales that couldn't quite be followed in the movies. Monsternia, a story I was working on in high school that I ended up retiring, was also a sandbox setting. But one of the reasons the story didn't work for me was because I was trying to put so much stuff into a singular storyline, and it made everything messy and not fun to work on. I wanted to explore things that didn't fit the main story, but sometimes were more fun for me to follow than the main storyline. I didn't really have my priorities straight, and that's the power of making an entirely original universe. You can do whatever the hell you want, even if I didn't know how I wanted to incorporate the lore and other stories into this universe properly. But this was also a story I was working on in high school, so you know, baby steps. Monsternia was the biggest lesson in making a story I learned, which is to condense your story to what it needs. Anything extra you want to explore is best left to the sides, or to be pulled from when the main story absolutely needs it. You can make tons of short stories with anything that does not fit in your main storyline. Unless you're working on an anthology series, it's easier to do a bunch of stories in one world instead of a big epic with huge branching storylines that the characters have to follow in this big path on their way to the big final fight. But guys, I did it. I made a new sandbox. My perfect sandbox. And oh boy, this thing has been swimming in my head since like late last year, and in February it has finally reached brainworm levels so massive, I gotta share it. I gotta talk about this thing. So I am finally making a video about Ascendo. I know I mentioned it a lot in the past couple months in videos and streams, and I even talked about some of the stuff we will be talking about in this video on those streams. But I really wanted to make a video that was bare bones lore video for what I came up with so far, and the baseline knowledge of the overall narrative. So we're doing that today. Well, there really isn't a singular story, just a bunch of plots that intersect sometimes, kind of like how they do in Hello from the Hollowoods, but not quite like Hello from the Hollowoods. I'll be making a separate video about the characters because I don't want this video to be way too long, and because I just did a character yapping video, so I need a little break from drawing art for that. But I am hoping to do a character video in the future. I just have a couple other ones I really want to do this year, so we'll see. I hope you're excited as I am, but before we talk about that, let's talk about the art for today's video. This is a painting from my Light series involving my 3 kids, who are mostly responsible for me getting over my mental block with Ascendo. Their names are Casper, Ping, and Seer. I got the idea for this piece from a piano someone at my university dumped in the woods next to the Fine Arts building, and I grabbed a bunch of reference pictures the last time I was there. Although I won't be talking about the kids in detail for this video, I hope you enjoy seeing their adorable faces as they play a broken piano. Now on to the video. Now to start this video off, we need to go back a bit before, because Ascendo did not come out of the blue from me. It came from, to put it kindly, me taking a hammer to a previous idea multiple times before it eventually became something I could start working with. So we're going to go back to 2022. I had the idea for a story that I was thinking of making into a novel, not a whole series of novels, just a one-book story, but never went through with it for reasons I will explain. The story was from an idea that mellowed out around in my mind, a story of a great battle that was the cover for a summoning ritual a second agent was performing. During the course of this battle, a knight interfused in the ritual, crossing paths with 2 other characters and accidentally causing said ritual to go haywire. This event ends up dooming the world, causing everything to slowly collapse, and the world's unavoidable ending will arrive within a year. I pitched this as a very rough idea to my best friend Joe, a story that came to mind when I was thinking about the actions one would take as the world was ending, and you couldn't stop it and it was your fault. I had our main characters figured out too. A runaway princess turned into a mercenary named Daniel Alvarez, a scholar named Tia Forte, and the knight, a man named Tallahassee Ward, or Tal for short. After some weeks of thinking of this story, I ended up not doing anything with it, mainly because I just couldn't make decisions on how I want to tell it. I also thought it would have been more interesting to see other people's reactions to that synopsis rather than coming up with the answers myself. In hindsight, this would have been an interesting D&D campaign, and I could have run that, but this idea also came around the time I was feeling burnt out being a forever DM, and I didn't want to run another game. But this idea never left my head, and instead it kind of morphed and changed. The eventual finality of the world idea got thrown out, and instead I was thinking of a world where I could retire my D&D and other various characters into, ones that didn't fit into the other stories I'm either currently working on or have living in the back of my mind as I plan on working on them when my current projects are finished. I picked at it and messed around with the idea, but there just wasn't that spark that told me there's a story here. Just the feeling that I couldn't put this idea down completely, even if the original intention of it was gone. It wasn't that I felt like I needed to make a story from this, but rather I needed a place I could put these characters that worked for them. Unfortunately, the story still came because I am a storyteller at heart. I messed around with these characters in this vague setting and thought about using Tal as a D&D character because he would have been a really cool fighter warlock multi-class if he was in the game, but nothing really ever happened with that. In late 2024, I was poking around with this world again and was thinking of a different kind of calamity. Instead of one of absolute finality, it would be a world that has already had its collapse and people are trying to live and thrive within this world that continues to suffer the consequences of that collapse. Think of like the Shattering in Elden Ring. I like post-apocalyptic stories, but I also like post-apocalyptic stories, where the world has started figuring out how to pick up the pieces and what to do with them, and I wasn't sure where I was going to go with this one. I added 3 characters from the original fantasy story, and I could add more, and I did. I brought in Calypso Fallstrike, the very first character I ever played as in a real tabletop RPG game, Margot Menace, my Bloodborne OC I rewrote for Ascendo, and Horace Draft, my Elden Ring character who I also rewrote for Ascendo. At this point, I also had a couple of hypothetical characters whose concepts later will become full characters, the head of a music school / orphanage who is both beautiful and monstrous, and a small musician whose vibes were just little guy. I was thinking of what this world could be like and struck a stronger, but still not quite right idea. The gods in this world have become mad and fragmented, but sometimes those pieces break off, and if a person comes in contact with these fragments, then they gain the unusual magical abilities from it. I tried to come up with a plot from that, and that wasn't really like something I was into. I really didn't want to write a big epic quest with a final god showdown, and it just wasn't interesting to me. I didn't like the chemistry with the characters that I had as like my main characters. I wanted a main cast that worked great with each other, and they just didn't, and I wasn't invested in trying to make them work. I was more interested in exploring their own goals that were separate from the rest of the characters' goals, rather than trying to make them all work together onto a common goal. If I wanted to do something set in this world, I needed to see my sights smaller, or at least figure out what needed to be changed in order to make Ascendo what I wanted it to be. This was also around the point I decided that the setting was going to be called Ascendo. I had the name in the back of my mind for a while, and I kind of like wavered on it, but then after a bit when I got to this point, I was like, oh no, this actually kind of fits. Now I'm going to pivot a bit to talk about a dream I had about a year ago. I've had some pretty vivid dreams in the past that stuck with me now, even like some that I took and made into characters and stories. I think my biggest one is Seamus Cantor from my webcomic In Harmony. He was originally a character from a dream. This dream is one of those vivid ones that stuck. It wasn't a super complicated dream. It was about an adult, a dog, and a little girl going through this post-apocalyptic land, avoiding the horrors following them with the help of a supernatural Polaroid camera. That stuck with me so much that I was thinking about making a short story with it, and I just let it stick around in my head. Then at the beginning of the year, I had the idea for these kids. Well, technically only for 2 of them, because Ping was the previously mentioned musician little guy, and guys, I got it. The first story for this setting. A trio of kids who are going through this world, trying to get to this magic music school, and one of them has a mysterious connection with the camera they carry with them, and it went downhill from there. It went so downhill from there. So now that we got to this part of the video, let's talk about what Ascendo is really about. I think I have it mostly nailed down at this point, but everything is subject to change, so if it does end up changing later, you're at least aware of it. Ascendo is a story that is a pseudo-linear, dark horror fantasy anthology. It follows the stories of characters experiencing their own, quote-unquote, end of the world, and how they cope with the aftermath, as they also deal with a world clawing to rebuild itself after its own great calamity. The story as a whole is told in separate chapters, but doesn't necessarily follow the same set of characters, nor are they all involved with each other's storylines. Everything instead is more so told in how it happens on the timeline rather than focusing on one character until their story is over and then moving on to the next one. Basically, if Ascendo was a novel, it would have it would have to like function structure-wise the way that a Song of Fire and Ice series tells its stories, but it also, to me, would not be fun to write Ascendo in that way, and I would prefer to make it work as like a game or a comic or an animated story. I haven't figured out yet how I want to tell this story. The only issue is that people will have to be really patient with how it is told, because it is going to bounce around a lot, and indie projects take longer to make than like fully fledged shows. I also have ideas to separate each chunk of stories into like quote-unquote books. My main focus right now is what would be book 1, but I want to explore different stories that would take place after book 1 in different areas in the world at different times. Just kind of like, bouncing around, messing with things, just whatever seems interesting to me. I have already been brainstorming an older Casper and Seer based off of where their story arcs in book 1 lead up to, and I'm slowly building up the bricks for Ping's doozy of a story. My little creature has so much going on, it's not even funny. Now that I talked about what Ascendo is, let's actually talk about the world and the world building and the events that led to where the story starts. Ascendo takes place on a world called Kanta. This world has magic, as its existence is considered to be like its own state of matter, and there are only 2 sources of magic, from the souls of living things on the planet and from the gods. I'll go a little more into when I get to the way of magic works in this world because it involves a bunch of other stuff, but it is important to know this because this world has 2 pantheons of gods, who are not creators of magic or of the creatures of Kanta, but rather were mentors of what they did with that magic. Each pantheon contains 9 gods each, and both pantheons follow a different ideal. The god's magic is unique because it doesn't work like how magic on Kanta works. Unlike with the creatures on Kanta, the gods of the world's magic are inconsequential and infinite, whereas the creatures on Kanta, their magic has a limit. It has specific limits that are kind of like counterbalances to each other because not everybody's soul works the same way. The gods' entire beings are made of magic, and they can cast magic as long as they want without having to stop the rest. Inconsequential magic. So the first pantheon is called the Chords, and that's Chords with a CH, unlike Artie's last name, which does not have a CH. The Chords believe in the idea of creation, taking what one can do and putting it out into the world, always striving to do more, make more, and progress more. A lot of Chordians, those who align themselves with the followers of the Chords, tend to be inventors, scholars, and artists, though the way magic is used in this world is almost entirely based around art. But more on that later when we get into the magic system more. The Chords believe that what you put out into the world to benefit those around you is the point of existing, to provide what you can do to others. Although the idea, when led to an extreme, leads to a chaotic and harmful selflessness, the idea with creation is to simply the idea of collective progress, using what you can provide to benefit everyone. The second pantheon, however, are the Cardinals. The Cardinals believe in the concept of order, how working on the self and what you can do to make yourself the best you is the most important thing. Most orderly societies don't have the great schools of progressions like the Chordians do, but rather guilds that provide different services, some that even reject using magic as much as they could. They don't entirely reject magic or don't allow magic, as that is as stupid as rejecting air and water, but they try to limit magic use to what is necessary to what needs to be done for the task at hand. Guilds tend to be built around physical tasks, certain labor, farming, etc., but there are also combat guilds. One of the biggest and most dangerous guilds to work for is the God Killers, which isn't an accurate name for what they do, but more on that later. The idea isn't to just only think of yourself, but rather growth comes from what you do for you, not what you do for the whole, and that is the best way for a society to function. In this way, society can be stronger and more balanced if filled with people who work on the individual first, lest you be distracted by petty outside quarrels. This can, as you can imagine, lead to a very authoritative style of rule if taken to the extreme with like a very individualistic outlook of life. But typical orderly societies probably also have the best therapists, I like to think. The gods are unique to this world because their magic isn't quite how magic on Kanta works, so it's best to talk about the creatures of Kanta. Like I said earlier, magic comes from living beings' different makeup of their soul, though in plant matter it's a bit more complicated and it works differently depending on who you are. We're going to get into some of the fantasy creatures I have fleshed out so far for this, however, I'm going to be referring to them as ancestries instead of races, because calling them races always sounded really weird to me, even like playing D&D. I'll have a different name for them later, but ancestry gets what I'm going for across for now. So far, what I have as ancestries that exist in this world are as follow: humans, elves, dwarves, animal people, and mer people. I want to maybe put plant people in, but the way plant people work is similar to how I have mer people work, but we'll get into that in just a minute. I'll be explaining ancestries around different magic soul types alongside each other, and hopefully it'll make sense why I'm doing it this way. So let's go. We'll start with humans who are not called humans in this world. They have a different name, and you guys have to be nice to me about this name because you're going to be side-eyeing me when I say what humans are called, and I promise it will make sense and be so valid once I'm done explaining. Do not look at me like that. Be nice to me, please. Humans in this world are called soulborn and are unique in their soul makeup because soulborn are the only ancestry who are born almost completely devoid of magic. As time moves on, a soulborn soul will absorb the magic around them. Relying on your soul to cast magic will eventually deplete the supply, but soulborn who are regular magic users learn to manipulate the magic in the world around them in order to perform magic, without actually touching their soul at all. And soulborn want to do this, not because using too much magic will kill them, at-world still faint and feel weak for a while afterwards, but because what happens when a soulborn dies. Soulborn have the typical human lifespan, but they can do something after death no other ancestry can. They can come back. The average soulborn who comes back tends to come back as a spirit, staying around for about another 100 years as their soul slowly burns off a lifetime supply of residual magic until they eventually fade away forever. A more powerful soulborn magic user, one who spent their time around great sources of energy and has rarely ever depleted their soul of its magic, could be strong enough to even possess their own corpse. That ability usually only being done by the most studious of Cordian scholars. Spirits still move through walls and stuff, so having a physical form you can use and manipulate is a bonus that a lot of Cordian scholars tend to like, as it lets them continue their work. Animal people, called familiars in Ascendo, their souls work exactly the same way as soulborn, but for a different reason. They're kind of like a subgenre of soulborn. Non-magical animals and soulborn have the same kind of souls, but most animal souls are weaker and they don't last as long, and carnivorous animals still hunt even after death. So sometimes, when an animal spirit is running or trying to hide from a predator, or if a bond between a soulborn and a departed pet is so strong, that animal can choose for its entirety to become a part of a stronger soul. Essentially, the animal soul is swallowed up by the soulborn soul, and the soulborns will be given not only a magic boost in their soul, but will also have some physical changes that are determined by a soul's strength. An older cat soul, one that is like slowly fading and it has maybe a couple years left, may give a soulborn cat ears and a tail, but a newly killed squirrel may turn a soulborn into a soulborn-shaped squirrel. And soulborn who have become attached to multiple animals may get different characteristics, becoming more animalistic, and even so much as slowly becoming, like, just the animal itself, eventually, just soulborn-sized. Upon death, the souls still remain attached to the soulborn soul, but in that way, familiars help animals lead 4 lives instead of the usual 2. Dwarves, on the other hand, have different souls than soulborn do. Dwarf souls are magical, but rather than storing or creating magic, their souls take magic in the world around them and funnel it through them, allowing dwarves to cast as much magic as they want, with almost no issue provided there is enough magic around them. However, this is where ancestries get a little fun, because dwarf souls work like an engine. Engines that usually have things going through them leave some kind of residue, which is why sometimes parts of an engine have to be replaced. And so thus, as dwarves age, they tend to become visually different from their younger counterparts, and these differences are environmentally based. Dwarves in forested areas may become covered in earth and plant life, resembling dirt golems. Those spending their life in the mountains or caves either start becoming stone or crystallized, depending on what they spend their time around. I guess you can imagine what dwarves that spend a lot of their life around machinery may look like. Dwarves later in life tend to resemble what would probably be called like the D&D equivalent of golems or warforged, but they're still dwarves, just bigger and bulkier than their younger counterparts. Eventually, near the end of a dwarf's life, their soul has trouble reaching the magic around them, the bulk of the magical residue becoming a sort of wall separating the soul from a magic source. At the end of a dwarf's life, they find a small resting spot and go into a meditative coma, a defense mechanism the soul does to preserve itself for as long as it can. But eventually that magic fades away, which leads to death. But luckily, it's a very peaceful one, all things considering. I like to imagine there are special dwarf graveyards people go to look at that are almost like fields of sleeping people. A comforting thought for the families left behind, and a peaceful final resting place for those who have never left. I am thinking merfolk will work the same way, but I haven't exactly decided what they would do. Because they're underwater, I'm thinking that they turn into coral, and that there's areas in some merfolk towns where there are gardens of older merfolk, still alive but stuck, and they spend all day gossiping and hanging out. I haven't fully decided yet, as merfolk don't even have a name that they're called in this universe quite yet, but I'm still brainstorming it, so there'll be more when I have something like that later. I did decide though that I want them to look more monstrous than just a pretty lady with a fishtail like in The Little Mermaid. I'm thinking about designing them like my OC Gilly. Like, I want my mer people to look monstrous! They look more pretty! I love the monstrous mer ladies. But let's talk about elves, because elves were the first one I figured out for all the ancestries, and I have been spending my time, every time I mention elves in Ascendo, I always talk about how fucked up they are, but I never really talk about why. So elf souls are basically the magical equivalent of a nuclear reactor, in which they are constantly producing their own magic. Because of that, not only are elves functionally immortal, but they also can perform so much magic at once and never get wiped from it, simply because each elf has their own personal supply of just constant energy inside of them. I imagine parties with magic users prefer having at least one elf on the team, as soulsborns and dwarves can essentially use an elf soul as a battery for their own magic, but being a walking magic source does have heavy flaws. Unless you're constantly using magic or someone is constantly feeding off of your magic, that magic has to go somewhere. In all cases, it turns on the elves' own bodies, causing them to change. The most common and first signs of body changes usually are in the teeth as they start getting pointier, the canines get a bit longer, so you get fangies. Elf skins and eyes may change colors, most of the time they'll grow horns, and although horns commonly grow on the head, it is not the only case. I have one of my characters, she has horns, her horns are on her leg from her back, and they twist around her side. I'll be getting into that when I talk about the characters for Ascendo. But it's not just horns either. Sometimes they'll grow wings and tails, and if you haven't figured out yet, this is kind of how I figured out how to put my own tiefling equivalent into Ascendo, minus the affinity to fire, you know. They're just fucked up elves. But these changes are constant, and they can get brutal. Extra limbs in uncomfortable places, too many horns growing, it's becoming harder to trim them. Several pairs of wings, there are so many they're impossible to fly with. Growing in such a size, it becomes uncomfortable just to be in rooms. The end of an elf's life is almost always in agony, and if an outside force doesn't kill them first, elves that die by aging don't die because of aging itself, but because they die because they either have grown to such a mass that their bodies just cannot handle that size, or they get impaled by a horn that wasn't shaven down properly. The downside of practical immortality. I think elves do have a strict regiment that they do to keep themselves down to like their horns shaven down to a manageable size, other things that they might have to do that aren't as pretty in order to like keep themselves alive. And although they do have like immortality and they can live for a very, 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 very long time, they do have more issues to deal with than some of the other ancestries do. Ages are also vastly different. Dwarves and elves can live for a very long time, like I said, whereas familiars and soulborn comparatively don't. Soulborns are typically the ancestry most other ones compare ages to, because most ancestries look close to soulborns, minus few changes at birth. The more different an elf and a dwarf look from a soulborn, the older an age can be estimated. I want to have an actual age system in place for Ascendo eventually to make it easier in-universe to discern ages. I mean, I have an elf character like Artie, who is considered to be young for an elf, but another character like Calypso, who is also an elf, but she would be considered older, as she has her horns and tail already grown in, and she has purple skin. But both of them, age-wise, are roughly in the human equivalent of their late 20s. I've been thinking of making a visual timeline for all ancestries, but again, that will have to be for later. Especially since I want to brainstorm the other ancestries I may want to include in Ascendo and how they work. And in order to do that, I need to make sure that it works with my magic system, as the equivalent of undead in this universe is just branches of one kind of soul, with the promise of not needing a functional body to continue existing. It's fun to think about how societies may think about these things. Now, I talked about how souls are magical in different ways, but how is that magic used? Well, basically, magic is used in art forms, and your attention determines how a spell is casted. I have classes made, but I don't call them classes for the story. It's not classes like in a D&D way. They're more like skills, like how when you're an artist and you do a lot of different types of art, kind of build up like that. There's none of this like multi-class and stuff like in D&D. Instead, you can learn the skills to use magic in a new way. I have a bunch figured out, but I would like to do more. These are just kind of the ones that I've been focusing on at the moment. One of these skills are conductors. Conductors look the most stereotypical to wizards, but that's only because they have wands. But the way magic works is different. It is a skill most commonly learned by soulborns, because the object of a conductor is to not like cast the fireball, as the wands are not made to do that, but rather to redirect the magic around you to do stuff. D&D type spells don't exist in this universe, but rather magic relies on manipulating what is already there. If a conductor was to get into a battle, most of their attacks would probably be wind-based, unless there is a nearby fire or water source that a conductor can manipulate with them. In traveling, a conductor may simply have items to create water or fire-based like attacks on hand. It also involves a lot with movement. Your movement affects like the direction of a spell and where it goes. That's why it's kind of not a good idea to use your hands, because it has to travel through a point, and hands are very hard to get an accurate, attack in. The conductors find that the wands are easier to use. There are also cartomancers who work similar to conductors, but their approach is very hands-off. Cartomancy uses the magic in the air around cartomancers to manipulate an on-hand deck of cards to move around them. I'm imagining these cards have like runes on them that perform different functions, whether to make small explosion from far away or to fly quickly at someone for an attack. I haven't quite worked out how runes work in this setting yet. I do want to like figure out like writing spells. So cartomancers at the moment are more on the side of, here's how the cards move, it looks cool, part of the like world building process, but I'll figure it out eventually. Of course, people are probably wondering if I have bards, and Ascendo technically does, but they're not called bards in this universe, and there's also two different types of them. There are vocalists and instrumentalists. Vocalists use their voice to direct magic, and is usually used to basically manipulate someone's emotions, like how singing can make you feel, using your own voice for a weapon and all that. Most vocalists tend to be elves, as you need a lot of energy to use magic for a long period of time, and you need a lot of magic in order to use it for a long period of time. So elves are pretty much like built to be the perfect vocalists. Instrumentalists, on the other hand, work the same way, but they use instruments instead of their voice, an easier skill on the soul to learn. Some accordion instructors who are a bit more flashy combine aspects of being a conductor to their instruments, what makes for a very showy, though not always practical show. Just having their instrument fly around in the air as they're playing. It seems like a good idea because you could use your instrument as a projectile, but it's also incredibly impractical because you have to use magic to both manipulate the instrument and play it. Easier to just play it yourself in your hands. I also just want to say that anyone can play an instrument and sing without having to use magic in this world. So I'm not saying that only elves can be singers. Remember, in Ascendo, magic is also based on intent. So if you're singing with no magical intent, it's just singing. There are also some other ones as well. Painting and photography work the same way, but photography is kind of seen as like a niche fad. Both can record brief moments of time, but where photography is accurate to the moment a photo is taken, painters can manipulate a setting. It's just basically like kind of like watching little scenes move around. I also have been working on what I call primitive technomancy, but that involves touching up some stuff I'm writing for a character in the story. Haven't quite mentioned this character yet in the video, and so I'm gonna like leave primitive technomancy for that now because this is still kind of like an in development thing. And if I did go farther into like including technomancy into Ascendo, it's probably going to be like very steampunk based instead of like futuristic. But of course, with all of this magic and these characters, they are still going to need places to live. I have been brainstorming a bunch of smaller places, some bigger ones that are not quite fleshed out enough yet, but for this video we're only going to be talking about two of them, just so you guys can learn a bit about how both accordion and an orderly society could exist. I do want to preface this and say that not every city will be exact copies of these two, and I have been thinking of towns that may not even lean either or, but I gotta get the vibes out there, guys. So we're going to talk about accordion society because that was the first of the two I came up with. That music school orphanage place, yeah, that got a bit more lore added onto it. Our accordion city is called Academy de Capo, and before you ask, this is the one thing that I will say, yes, I did take this from Malevolent, but no. That's the only thing. Academy de Capo is a music school young mages go to learn how to use magic. Well, it's more accurate to say used to go to because the school has taken a new role in the last couple hundred years. While it still technically functions as a magic school, the Kappa has had to take in towns of refugees, expanding beyond its walls in order to take in more citizens who come to the academy for aid. Magic is still taught to those who want to learn how to use it, but most people who come to the massive school these days just want protection from the danger outside of the Kappa's walls. Dangers that we quite haven't got into yet, but we'll save that for later in the video. I imagine the Capo being a massive and tall school, kind of like Rhea Lucaria in Elden Ring, but not quite shaped like Rhea Lucaria, definitely something that's a bit more livable. I just want it to be impossibly giant and elegant, a tower, a piece of art in its own right, now having to play the role of both a temple of accordion study and home for those with nowhere else to go. And the studies behind the Kappa's walls are the kind that already have changed the world. But again, more on that later in the video. The leaders of accordion cities usually have an artistic name as their title. So far there are professors who are teachers, but that's really an easy one. The highest rank that anyone can get in Cordia society are the curators. Different cities have different laws pertaining to how their government works, as governments are a city-by-city basis. In the Kappa's case, there is only one curator of the school, and that is an elf named Loki, one of the oldest elves, at least currently in the story, who has had her own range of things going on. She oversees the stuff about the Kappa's studies, but we will be talking about that later. The other city, one that is more like a city than an academy de Capo, is an orderly city called Seraphim. Unlike the regal elegance of the Capo, Seraphim resembles more of a Victorian-era city and is located next to the sea, so it has a massive shipyard. Seraphim also has large castles, but those are home to the government bodies, where they work and live with their immediate families. Seraphim's government is different from the Kapos. The leaders of orderly societies call themselves saints, and Seraphim is not run by just one saint, but a council body of them that votes on regular issues together. The position is monarchical, however, in which when a saint dies, the role is given to the next oldest offspring. If there is no heir, then the council votes on which family gets to take up the role as the next saint. The role of a saint does not pass on to siblings, only the oldest, unless the oldest dies before the title can be passed down. When a saint comes into the position, the siblings and any surviving parent is removed from the castle. Only a spouse and offspring can remain inside. They'll be taken care of and provided for as by orderly law, but a strict rule is in place to minimize anything that could become a sabotage or result in family quarrels. It's better to work on yourself until a time comes when the council notices your work than to spend that self-work on schemes and deceit. Seraphim saints also wear masks when out publicly and are only allowed to take them off when alone or alone with family. I'm gonna leave it there for now because there's one incredibly important bit of information that I've just been neglecting. And I've been dropping hints and saying, wait till later, all just through the video, but I left out the most incredibly important stuff about the story now, didn't I? I did say this was supposed to be a post-apocalyptic story, right? The courts and the cardinals came to Kanta, somewhere no scholar has been quite able to figure out, bringing magic of their own. Magic that doesn't seem to run out or change, that requires no source. Powerful magic. God magic. The things these beings can do with their magic isn't anything like anyone on Kanta could do before, limited to manipulating what's around them, rather than purely bursting with an inconsequential wave of energy. How can anyone on Kanta not see that as godlike? And yet, it never means that they're untouchable. Unkillable maybe, but everything has a downside, and for the gods, it came to them in the form of something they call a blight. Not quite a god, not quite a disease, but a virus that's attached itself onto each of these beings, and with it, slowly began eating away at their being, leaving the rest of Kanta untouched otherwise. As the gods became aware of a terrible truth, they could possibly, sometime, someday, die. With it, everything they are will be gone, eventually forgotten. Both pantheons discussed what to do with each other, and one of them, rather than weighing their options, wasted no time with action. The courts came to a solution, a very rash one, that, while not preferable, will at least be something they could do to preserve what is left of themselves. They would give themselves away, pieces, just small enough as their magic is so mighty, that a mortal being can contain it. These beings will then carry their legacy on until eventually the gods pass on, devoured by the blight, or just simply scattered among their mortal ones. They wasted no time in acting, beginning to give pieces of themselves to people, but mortal things were never meant to be divine. And with the gods' gifts came a new corruption that began devastating Kanta. Mortal beings now suddenly being given the pieces of gods, transformed in horrible ways, mutating, growing, devouring, and destroying the world around them. Unable to work with the god magic given to them, these beasts were simply referred to as the divine. Demi-godlike beings that, while still can be killed, are difficult to do so and cause so much destruction as their minds go mad from the god magic given to them. New guilds such as the God Killers eventually are formed, as the need for those to hunt down and track these beasts became unnecessary overnight. But even with the divine causing chaos, this did not deter the courts, and to this day still choose unlucky victims to give themselves to. There are some Cordians who see the divine as just that, divine. Blessed by the gods despite the chaos they bring, therefore condemn the god killers for their blasphemous actions. But their complaints prove nothing more to a nuisance to orderly societies, and thus a new kind of rift forms between each group. The cardinals, seeing the court's mistakes, decided on a different approach. Rather than letting more innocent people come destroyed by their power, the cardinals decided to lock themselves up underground, away from everything, and for a time this worked. Until more divine, a stranger set of creatures than the predictable surface ones, began clawing themselves out of the ground. No cardinal has emerged yet, but their plan has failed. How no one has been able to figure out, as the land below is even more treacherous than the one above. And things have been like this for hundreds of years. Cordian societies have had a harder time for it, while some seeing the divine as holy things to keep, while orderly cities try to keep themselves together. Then the unthinkable happens. Academy de Capo has some of the most brilliant Cordian minds. One of those, a young elf named Tia Forte. Tia was a quiet student, one who was into the study of souls, but also god magic. Although many academics in the past have tried to find ways to extract or channel god magic, none have been successful. But then Tia Forte comes across the idea of something. For a brief moment of time, soulborn souls are entirely non-magical, and these non-magical souls can store magic without it escaping, unlike other souls. How can a non-magic thing be magical? How can a non-magical thing stop magic? And could that work on a god? They began their work and came up with the first prototype of what is to be called a paradoxical needle. I won't say how they tested it and figured out how it worked. That is spoilers for some stuff I want to tell, either eventually in a story or when I do a Meet the Characters video, but the way the paradoxical needle works is in the name. The object itself is a paradox. How can you make a non-magical item magical? How can a magic object be devoided of magic? Tia figured it out, and not only that, it worked. Mostly worked, for the needle has to be used shortly after somebody is given divinity, otherwise the magic spreads out too much and the needle can't contain it into itself. Not only that, it has to be inserted at a certain point, usually where the magic enters the host. This could be anywhere simply from an arm, leg, or chest, or more vulnerable areas like the neck, eye, or heart. And after all, you're still stabbing someone, and if you don't get it in the right spot, it'll work just as well as a knife when it comes to bodily harm. The paradox needle doesn't get rid of divinity, but rather contains it within the body instead. This has extra magical consequences to the host that I'll leave for another time, but at the time of our story starts, the needle has been a known thing in the Capo for some years, with Cordian cities slowly getting rumors from the Capo about this item. There are 3 main professors at the school who go about to try to save as many people as they can with this device. Horace Draft, an ex-god killer who has since left orderly society and has given their loyalty to curator Loki. Calypso Fallstrike, ex-Cordian royalty and one of the most esteemed scholars that has ever stepped foot into Capo. And Tia Forte, the inventor of the Paradox Needle, and who has since mysteriously disappeared just before our story starts. But the first story of Ascendo doesn't start with the orderly city of Seraphim, stuck in its ways as it tries to protect itself from the monsters the gods made, nor does it start in Academy de Capo, where a curator and her fellow academics search for their missing prodigy. Ascendo starts with 3 children, lost in the world of monsters in deceit. A soul-born boy running from a home that doesn't want him, a familiar who dreams of studying magic but is afraid to leave with the truth of what has happened to his home behind, and a soul-born girl who can't make a sound, carrying a camera that holds something in it. And that is a wrap for this video. I hope it's a good enough explanation for what Ascendo is. Again, some of it may be subject to change, but I wanted something I could point people to and say, watch this if you don't know what I'm talking about. I'm gonna play with this project for quite a while before I start doing anything with it, mainly because I'm still working on In Harmony, and I've already planned my next, albeit shorter, story for when Not Quite Somewhere Else is over and I can work on a different thing instead. I'm not going to talk about that one on YouTube though, because that is still in its development phase, and I still have years of Not Quite Somewhere Else to finish first. Yay! But I will be talking all about it when I do, because it's going to be something completely different from stuff I've made in the past, and I'm actually really excited to get to it. But if you do want sneak peeks for the concept of that and things with Ascendo in the future too, then you could become a patron. Patrons get access to concept art, sketch pages, monster blogs, and more. Those at the Myonic level get early access to In Harmony pages, which, speaking of, I have a webcomic. In Harmony is free to read on inharmony.the-comic.org, so if you like stories about college kids running in the woods, looking for monsters, and unwise photography trips, then you may like this one. By the way, Chapter 4 comes out on September 14th. If this video isn't up by then it probably has already been up. You should go read it. Go check it out. I would appreciate it so much. I worked so hard on the comic. I want more people to read it. I want everybody to enjoy it if they like horror and monsters. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye!